In this video, I want to talk about participles, specifically the present adverbial participles. And when we think about participles, we call participles verbal adjectives. And the reason we call them verbal adjectives is because participles are going to share some characteristics with verbs, and then they're going to share some characteristics with adjectives. And so the characteristics that they share with verbs are that participles are going to have tense, voice, and mood. For participles, the mood is always going to be participle. And so now you know two moods. You have indicative mood and then participle mood. And so we are going to think about tense and voice. You already know voice. There's going to be active voice, middle voice, or passive voice. In terms of participles, we're going to learn three tenses. So present tense, aorist tense, and perfect tense. And that's in contrast to the five tenses we learned with the indicative: present, future, imperfect, aorist, and perfect. And so when you think about the verbal side of participles, think tense, voice, and mood. When you think about the adjective side of participles, think case, number, and gender. And so we might have a nominative singular masculine participle. We might have a feminine dative, a dative plural feminine participle. And so when you think about participles, and particularly the morphology, when you think about this logically, this means that we could have 24 forms of the participle for the present active. We'll have 24 forms for the present middle passive. We'll have 24 forms for the aorist active, the aorist middle, and the aorist passive. And then we'll have 24 forms for the perfect active and 24 forms for the active middle passive. And so I've lost count. That's 7 sets of 24 paradigms or 24 forms. And so we've got a lot of paradigms to memorize when you think about the participles. But take heart. The participial paradigm is going to be based off of the 2-1-2 and the 3-1-3 respectively. And so in some ways you've already memorized these paradigms. You just kind of have to put a few pieces together. When I think about the difficulty of the participle, really what's more difficult is the grammar behind the participle, because I think the paradigms tend to make a little bit more sense. When you think about the grammar of the participle really has two purposes. A participle can be adverbial, and if it's adverbial, it's going to modify the verb. And so adverbial participles are going to describe the action of the verb. They're going to enhance the description of the action of the verb somehow. The second way a participle can function, or the second purpose, is that it can be adjectival. And if it's adjectival, then the participle is going to modify the noun somehow. And so just like an adjective, the participle is going to agree with the noun that it modifies in case, number, and gender. That's why we have so many participles. And so when we think about the purpose of the participle or the function of the participle, really we have two functions: an adverbial participle and an adjectival participle. And so this week we're only going to talk about adverbial participles. Later we'll talk about adjectival participles. But in the back of your mind, kind of tuck that away. When we say adverbial, what we mean is modifying a verb. And when we say adjectival, we mean modifying a noun. In the next few slides, I want to go over the morphology. And like I said earlier, the morphology can seem overwhelming because of the sheer number of forms that we have to look at when we think about the participle. But I'm going to break it down just into a few rules, and you'll see that it basically follows the 3-1-3, the 2-1-2, and particularly when we look at participles that follow that 3-1-3 pattern, they're really going to be close to the adjective pos, both in the first and the third declensional patterns. So pretty straightforward. And so the difficulty, I think, with participles is going to be on the grammar. And so really kind of try to make short work of memorizing the morphology of the participles. So by way of review, this is our 313 pattern adjective for pos. And the two things that you need to know about writing out that third declension, the first thing that you need to know is the budak. So the budak, sasia es ansias, that gives us the endings. And so here's sigma sas I a es on si as. And here we have a movable nu. I usually ignore the nu when we're thinking about the budak, sasia as ansias. And then the second thing that you need is the stem. And so here's the adjective stem. You have to go down a level to the genitive to get the stem of the adjective. And so here our stem is pont. And that os there is the ending. And so pont is our stem. You have to go down a level because our nominative singular masculine contracts. And so we're not going to see the stem there. So if you have those two things, write out your stem 8 times. Pont, 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 pont. Write out the budak, sasia es ansias. And then you'll see we get the contraction here in the masculine nominative singular and the dative plural. So easy enough there for the masculine. The neuter pattern is similar. Instead of an ending there in the masculine and the accusative, it's empty, and so there's no ending here. And so what happens to that tau is the tau just drops off. What happens in our masculine is the sigma contracts with the tau and the nu, and that's why we have this little circumflex up here. With the neuter, there's no ending, and so that tau just drops off of the stem, and so we get pon with the circumflex. With the neuter, our neuter noun rules kick in. So pon is our nominative form, and our accusative, they're going to be identical. And then our genitive and dative are going to be identical to the masculine. And then for the plural, we get that alpha in the ending, and the nominative and accusative are going to be identical, so panta. And then the genitive and dative are going to be identical to the masculine. So the masculine and the neuter, pretty straightforward third declension pattern for pos. Our first declension, our feminine form here, and so this is where we get our 3, 1, 3. It's going to follow a normal first declension pattern, but note here that we have this sigma here, and so this is going to be Czax, which means if you get the sigma, the zeta, or the xi at the end of the stem, we're going to get an alpha, eta shift. So the feminine form for pas is pasa, and then it shifts to eta, pas ace, then eta again, pas a with the iota subscript, and then the accusative shifts back to alpha, pasan. And then the plural, pasai, pason, pasais, pasas. So pretty straightforward 313 declensional pattern. Now, why are we reviewing pos? Well, because our present active participle is going to be based on this new tau ending. And so the endings for our present active participle are going to be very close to what we've seen in pos. And so let's look at our genitive singular form of the masculine participle here to kind of break it down. And so when we think about the participle, particularly our present active participle, we're going to use our first principal part. And so for luo, the principal part never changes. That stem is always going to be lambda upsilon. But for second aorist verbs, we're going to use that first principal part. Then we're going to have the connecting vowel. And then we're going to have a new tau, which tells me this is the participle morpheme. And then we're going to have our endings. And so our third declensional endings are going to be sasia es ansias. And so why the present active participle masculine nominative, nominative singular masculine form contracts luon I have no idea. But basically, the sigma comes up against the tau drops out, the sigma drops out, and the omicron lengthens to an omega. You're just going to have to memorize that's luon. And then after the masculine nominative singular, the endings are pretty predictable. We have luontas, luonti, luonta, and then the plural luontes, luonton, and then we get a contraction here with the dative plural luusin or luusi, and then we shift back to our normal pattern luontas. And so again, it's going to be very similar to pos. We get that because we have that new tau, so a lot of the contractions are going to be identical, and we're going to get the contraction in the masculine nominative singular and the dative plural. The neuter pattern, very similar. Again, there's not going to be an ending here in our nominative or accusative, so that tau just drops. So luon, luontas, luonti, luon. Note here our genitive and dative are going to be identical to the masculine, and the nominative and accusative are going to be identical. And then the neuter plural, we get that alpha there, so now the tau's retained. Luonta, luonton, luusi, luonta. Our nominative and accusative are going to be identical, and our genitive and dative are identical to the masculine. And then the first declensional pattern, our feminine pattern here, our tense, our connecting vowel and tense morpheme is going to change. Instead of the connecting vowel plus nu tau, we have omicron, upsilon, sigma. And so that's going to be our tense morpheme. And it's going to follow our first declensional pattern. So since we have that sigma here, we're going to get the alpha eta shift in that singular pattern. So luusa, luuses, luuse with the iota subscript, luusan, and then the plural luusai, luuson, luusais, luusas. So again, pretty straightforward. The reason I showed you pos is because I wanted to show you the similarity between pos and our present active participle. And when you look at pos and you compare it to the present active participle, really the only change is going to be in our masculine nominative singular form there, which was pos, and now it's luon. It's a little oddity there, but for the most part, we're dealing with the same kind of paradigm. Another paradigm that we're asking you to memorize is ame. But again, this is not one that's going to be difficult for you to memorize. Basically, if you compare this to luo, the present active participle of luo, it's the endings. Instead of luon, we have on. Instead of luontas, we have ontas. Instead of luonti, we have onti. Instead of luonta, we have onta. One thing to watch out for, note here that every form begins with a vowel or a diphthong. And so whenever you have a word that begins with a vowel or a diphthong, you're going to have that breathing mark. And here it's going to be a smooth breathing mark throughout. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this paradigm. It's so easy to memorize, particularly if you have that present active participle form of luo memorized, then ame is not going to be difficult. It's just going to be the endings, and then watch out for that breathing mark. This is the present middle passive participle, and probably easier than the present active participle. But note here that we're going to have our first principal part, lu. We're going to get the connecting vowel, and then our tense morpheme that tells me I'm dealing with a middle passive participle. Our middle participle is going to be min. And then note here, our paradigm is going to follow the 2, 1, 2 paradigm. And so a little bit easier paradigm, a little bit more basic paradigm with fewer contractions. Note here, whenever you see this min, that is an ending That's our primary active endings for the indicative. So you want to be careful with that. That can be, you could confuse that with our first person plural indicative forms. But also just note, whenever you see men, think men in the middle. So if you have men in the middle, that means you're dealing with a middle participle. So again, first principal part, connecting vowel, men, and then our 212 endings. And so this is going to follow lagos, graphe, ergon. And so our second declension masculine form, lagos, lagu, lago, lagon, luaminos, luaminu, luamino, luaminon. And then the plural, lagoi, lagon, lagois, lagus, luaminoi, luaminon, luaminois, luaminus. Our second declension neuter form, no big surprise here. It's going to look like ergon. And so ergon, ergo, ergu, ergo, ergon, luaminon, luaminu, luamino, luaminon. Our nominative and accusative are going to be identical, and the genitive and dative are going to be identical to the masculine. And so really, really straightforward paradigm here for the neuter, second declension neuter. The plural, erga, ergon, ergois, erga. Here we have luamina, luominon, luominois, luomina. Again, nominative and accusative are identical. We get the alpha there to tell us we're dealing with the plural. The genitive and dative are identical to the masculine. The feminine, this is going to be a pretty normal first declension pattern. Luamine, luaminase, luamine with the iota subscript, luaminane, and then the plural, luamini, luaminon, luaminase, luaminos. So really easy, straightforward paradigm with our present middle passive participle. In the next few slides, I want to talk about the grammar and the syntax of the participle. And hopefully you've looked at the morphology of the participle, and it is a little bit more of a review of the 212 and the 313 paradigm. And so not too difficult. I think where a lot of the complexity and maybe the subtlety of the participle really comes into play is with the grammar and syntax of the participle. And so over the next few slides, I want to talk about the grammar of the participle. First of all, we've already explained this. The participle is a verbal adjective. And what we mean by that is it can act like a verb, but it can also act like an adjective. And when it acts like a verb, we're gonna parse that in terms of tense, voice, and mood. The mood's always going to be participle. And then as an adjective, we're going to parse it in terms of case, number, and gender. And then this last point, participles are non-finite verbs. And basically what that means is that there's no person involved with the participle. And so if you can parse a verb for person, that means that it's a finite verb. And so since you can't parse the participle for person, then it's a non-finite verb. And so when we parse a participle, we're going to give the verbal information first and then the adjectival information. So our participle luantas, here we get our first principal part, our connecting vowel, which tells me it's present. The new tau tells me I'm dealing with a participle, an active participle. And then our os ending here tells me the person and number. So this is going to be a present active participle, so tense, voice, mood. And then case, number, gender, genitive, singular, masculine. Now, just like our third declension nouns, you guys are going to see that omicron ending, and you're going to think, oh, that's like lagos. So that's nominative, singular, masculine. But you have to remember that we're dealing with our third declension, so that's actually going to be genitive, singular, masculine. Remember, sa, sia. And so watch out for that, that ending there. So the basic difference between finite and non-finite verbs: finite verbs are limited, but non-finite verbs are not limited. And so the limitation is person. So if we can parse a verb for person, then it's a finite verb. If we can't parse a verb for person, then it's non-finite verb. And so if we go back and we thought about how we parsed Luantas, we would see there's no person. There's no first person, second person, third person. There's number, but that number is kind of attached to the adjectival information. And so when we parse, for example, lues, this is going to be a second person singular present active indicative. So you are loosing, and so thus it's a finite verb. But luantes, this is going to be a present active participle, nominative plural masculine. So again, get that first principal part, the connecting vowel. The new tau tells me it's an active participle. And then our endings, saciat, es oncias, this is going to be nominative plural masculine. And so since there's no person, first person, second person, third person, it's going to be non-finite. Adverbial participles are going to act like verbs, but they're always dependent on another finite verb. And so right now, you guys know two types of verbs. You know indicative verbs and participles. And so our indicative verbs, we parse for person, so these are going to be finite verbs. And so adverbial participles are always going to be dependent on finite verbs. And so since they modify a finite verb in some way, we're calling them adverbial. Later, we're going to learn about adjectival participles. Adjectival participles are going to modify nouns or adjectives, but adverbial participles are going to modify verbs, and specifically, they're going to modify finite verbs. And so what does this look like? Here's this phrase, legon tata hi Jesus ab elthen. And so our main clause is going to have our main verb, ab elthen, and then our nominative is going to be hi Jesus. So our main clause is hi Jesus ab elthen. So Jesus left. If you just typed Jesus left in Microsoft Word, that's a complete sentence. We don't need anything else. Jesus left. What our participle clause does is this participle modifies the verb. And so note here, we get our first principal part, leg, we get the connecting vowel, and then the ending there, leg on. So this is going to be an present active participle. Nominative, singular, masculine form of lego. So saying these things. And so our participle, we're going to translate our participle as saying. And then talta is our direct object, going back to legon. And so it's our substantival form of the demonstrative, so saying these things. That's how we're going to translate that clause. So Jesus left saying these things. That's how we would translate that clause. Or we could translate it with the participle clause first. Saying these things, Jesus left. And so if we wanted to diagram this, it's pretty straightforward. We would put our main clause on the baseline, so Jesus departed, and then our participle would go on a vertical terrace. And so our participle would go on the vertical terrace, and then the object of that participle, or the direct object of that participle, would go after an object marker. So the diagramming for our participle clauses are going to be pretty straightforward. Particularly an adverbial participle, you want to put it on that vertical terrace. So Jesus departed, saying these things. And so our participle clause describes something adverbial to the verb in the main clause. And so in this case, it describes what Jesus was doing when he left. And so writers can use the participle to describe two actions that are occurring that the subject is doing at the same time. And so it's just a stylistic way of describing the scene. And so the participle's time is relative to the time of the main verb. And so unlike indicative verbs that have tense and aspect, the participle is only going to have aspect. And so we don't know the time of the action just by looking at the verb. The time of the participle, the time of the action of the participle is relative to the main verb. And so our present tense participles are going to portray this continuous action, this ongoing action. And so our present tense participle legon here is going to describe this present tense action. But since our main verb is aorist, up elthen, we get the elth there. So this is going to be 3s, aorist, active, indicative. And so Jesus' departure occurred past time. And so by nature of his departure occurring past time, even though our participle is in present tense or present time, it's continuous with his departure. And so a good rule of thumb is to translate our participle with the key word while. And so while saying these things, Jesus left, or Jesus left while saying these things. That's how we're going to bring that out.